Hello and welcome. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. These lines from a poem by British writer Rudyard Kipling date back to 1899 and reflect the Western world's attitude back then towards the poor of developing nations. It was not all that long ago that some schools in the West used to raise aid money by asking children for pennies for black babies or something similar. Well, in recent years, aid to places like Africa has gone through an evolution, with something of a battle between those who believe it's all about giving money and those who think that that does more harm than good. It's a cause that has attracted Hollywood and music industry celebrities such as Bono or Bob Geldof calling for debt relief for Africa. So have the hundreds of billions of dollars of Western aid to Africa helped or hurt? The foreign ministers of the G8 have just been meeting in Germany in advance of next week's G8 summit with yet more promises of aid for Africa. One prominent American economist has argued for years that the West has failed and continues to fail in its aid plans for the poorest of the poor. Professor William Easterly teaches economics at the New York University and is co-director of the university's Development Research Institute. He spent 16 years as a research economist at the World Bank. His latest book, The White Man's Burden, takes its title from that Rudyard Kipling poem I quoted you. Professor Easterly joins us today to explain why, as he puts it, the West's effort to aid the rest have done so much ill and so little good. Professor, it's good to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Sir, obviously that first question has to be, taking into consideration the title of your book, why so much ill and so little good?
Well, there's really two big factors. One is that aid money often props up corrupt dictators and makes them stay longer in power, makes the governments of poor countries more accountable to the aid donors than they are to their own people. And second, just throwing money at the problem really hides the whole question of whether the aid is really reaching the poor. There's so much focus on just the amount of money spent that nobody is asking, is this aid money actually reaching the poorest of the poor?
But isn't that more a situation that occurred 10 or 15 years ago? Haven't people started to ask the right questions, and hasn't there been a lot more accountability in where the money goes and what's done with it?
The aid agencies always claim that they are new and improved versions of their old selves. That's their answer to every criticism. Yes, that was true back then, but now we're better. Unfortunately, none of the indicators, either anecdotal or in the statistics that I study, show any signs of improvement.
Well, give us the reason you chose that title, The White Man's Burden, for your book.
Well, I see a continuity between the old sort of racist attitude towards the rest of the world and what is now no longer so explicitly racist, but still very paternalistic attitude towards the West. People like Bono and Tony Blair, they say things like, it's up to us to save Africa. And I find that incredibly patronizing and rather insulting, frankly, to Africans. Africans can solve their own problems just like the rest of us.
Now, you do suggest that there exists this sense of moral duty, I guess, to help the poor, whether they need help or not. So, I mean, does that imply they don't want the help?
Well, of course they would like the help if it was provided in an effective way and that left them lots of autonomy to choose what they want. Unfortunately, both of those conditions are violated. Aid is kind of forced down the throat of the poor countries with lots of conditions attached, which often destroy the effectiveness of the aid. And the poor have very little voice, very little ability to give any feedback on whether they're getting what they want or not. They're completely powerless.
So how do you think, Professor, how do you think the aid programs for places like Africa and developing nations have evolved over, say the past quarter of a century?
Well, they've gotten a lot better at public relations. That's the positive. That's what gives the impression of positive progress. Unfortunately, the hard facts don't support the idea of progress. Africa continues to be the poorest region in the world, even though it's the most aid-intensive region in the world. It's had the worst economic growth. It's basically had zero rise in living standards since independence, despite $568 billion in aid going to Africa over that time period.
Now, I know there's been criticism often that developed nations are being forced to westernize when they'd rather look to modernize. To what extent do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think the real general issue is the idea that the West is forcing the poor countries to change in ways that the West thinks are best. And that's really a destructive approach, because it either has no effect, which is of course useless, or if it does have an effect, then there's tremendous resentment towards the West because outsiders are forcing you to change. Nobody likes that. I mean, would Americans like it if Canada told us how to run our government or our fiscal policy? Of course not. And people in poor countries are just the same.
Well, Professor, of course, in the G8 is going to meet next week, and they made an ambitious plan in 2005 at the Gleneagles Summit to provide a comprehensive aid package for Africa and the developing world. Let's have a look at some of the things that they've suggested. For example, doubling of aid by 2010. That's an extra $50 billion worldwide, and 25 of that for Africa. Writing off debts of 18 of the world's poorest countries. A commitment to end all export subsidies. WTO set a 2030 deadline. More accountable governments. Universal access to HIV/AIDS treatment by 2010. Funding treatment to the bed nets, a big issue. Fight malaria, saving the lives of 600,000 children every year. Full funding to eradicate polio. 2015, all children to have good education and healthcare where possible. Those all sound very good and sound like worthy goals. Surely there should be some support for that kind of idea.
Well, most of the attention has been attracted by this pledge to double aid. And doubling of aid has this great symbolic role. Whenever anyone starts to worry about the problems of poor people, anytime in the last 50 years, they have always called for exactly doubling of foreign aid. I've actually documented this in about 10 different aid documents going back into the 1950s. So it seems to be like a token. But of course, this is just this by itself does not necessarily accomplish anything. These are the costs of helping poor people. These are not the benefits that you bring to poor people. Stressing the aid money spent and doubling the aid money spent, this would be like General Motors saying, oh, we're going to double our costs. Isn't that great? Don't the shareholders love us? Well, that would be ridiculous for a private firm, and it's actually equally ridiculous for the aid industry.
Well, let's see. I mean, I've spoken over the last couple of years to a number of key players talking about issues such as aid and development and so on. One of them was obviously a very prominent character in all this, Bob Geldof, and this is what he had to say when it came to, well, as he describes, a eureka moment.
They think there's a eureka moment. Well, you didn't make poverty history. Of course not. It's a strapline, but we did begin. And it's a difference in 20 years. We could only deal with the symptoms 20 years ago. We truly began to deal with the structures of poverty last year.
And dealing with the structure of poverty, you feel that's not the case?
Well, first of all, I'm really struck by how Bob Geldof uses this word we. We are starting to help them. Again, it seems to be the white man's burden in action, or maybe the white band's burden in the case of the